name is Luke Kehoe, and today I'm interviewing Deryck Fay for his really fascinating book, Connecting a Nation. Deryck wrote this and published it during the thick of the pandemic. And for anyone that knows me, I'm very active in the telecom space in Ireland as a market analyst and work with a number of different players in the industry over the last number of years. And Deryck reached out to me just on my arrival home from spending some time in Asia and said, would I be able to chat to him about the book? And he was very kind and sent me out a copy of the book, and I've really enjoyed reading it. It's been a fascinating read, and I do recommend anyone else who hasn't already to read it, and I think it'll be a resource that I will come back to for many years. And Deryck, if you want to give yourself a quick introduction, and then I'm going to ask some questions today about my own, I suppose, interest in the book, and hopefully we'll get a unique perspective from the author himself.
Thank you very much, Luke. So the book was published in 2021 after a few years of research. I wrote it because I was always interested in infrastructure, and I'd read lots of books about railways and everything down to history of the ESB and water supply in Dublin, and I was working in the telecoms industry, and I'd always been interested in telecoms just as any form of infrastructure, and I found there was no book about the history of it. There's a book about the history of every obscure little railway line in Ireland, but nothing at all about telecoms, which employs, probably more people than the railway industry. The final straw was when, a few years ago, on the doorstep, I met a neighbour, and she said that she just signed a book deal to publish a book about the history of the iron sweater. And at that point I decided, okay, if there's a market for a history of the iron sweater, there's a market for an interest in the story of telecommunications in Ireland. So I started at that point.
Very good, and I think it's definitely a gap in the market, and I think, as I mentioned, it will be a resource for years to come, and not just for people who are deeply embedded in the telecoms ecosystem in Ireland, like myself, and I'm sure others that will watch this interview, but also the casual reader. And I've actually found it's been very accessible and speaks, I suppose, a historic context that I think would be relatable to many people in Ireland.
That's good. That was the aim of it, was to be accessible to the general reader. I wanted to have a story, not to be too technical and too geeky, but to be technically and historically accurate as well.
Exactly. I think that's one of the things we struggle with in the telecoms industry, is to be relatable. It's we're often bamboozled with acronyms, so it's great that you've managed to make it accessible.
Yeah, I think all of technology and science can suffer from that. So I just wanted to try and steer a path through the jargon and make it accessible for all.
Exactly. So I wanted to start by kind of framing the context for the listeners today. So the story in Connecting a Nation spans more than 170 years, starting with the first telegraph cable being landed in Howth in 1852. Are there particular points in the book and in the story that you would regard as pivotal and I suppose influential?
Yeah, I can think of three inflection points. The first one was around the time of the War of Independence and the Civil War, when it was really a negative one. There was a lot of damage done to infrastructure. Ironically, there hadn't been enough damage done to the infrastructure during the Easter Rising to stop the authorities suppressing the rising, and the fact that the telephone network in Dublin more or less survived intact through the rising meant that the authorities had an upper hand there. There's a whole chapter about that, and the telephone was used extensively during the rising to get to summon the forces to suppress it. But over the course of the following years, with the War of Independence and Civil War, there was a lot of damage of telecoms infrastructure, and it kind of meant that, so when the Free State was founded, that they were playing catch up, trying to restore some of the damage, and I guess that set us back. The other thing it seemed to do was that the damage to some of the international facilities, like the cable stations in Kerry and the Marconi station in Galway, left an air that maybe Ireland was a little insecure, and perhaps you shouldn't use it as a base for your international telecoms infrastructure. And perhaps that lasted. I mean, there wasn't a new transatlantic cable land in Ireland until 1989. From 1922 until 1989. That's a long time. Now there were technical reasons for that, but other cables were landed in Europe in other places. So that was inflection point number one, not a good one, and a sad kind of somewhat sad start to the beginning of the state. The next one is around 1979, by which stage the state of the telecoms industry, or the telecoms network, was really a bit of a national scandal, and I think the government realised that it was a liability. And they, in quite straitened economic times, I mean, in the early 80s, they put through what was called an accelerated development plan and pumped hundreds of millions into the network, and really just changed it. They revolutionised it. So we went from, people went from telephones and manual exchanges where you had to wind a handle to a push button phone connected to a digital exchange. And that happened within a few years. So that was a very important inflection point. And the third one, I think, I can date to around 1997, 98, when Aircell, as was, introduced Ready to Go, which was a lot of people remember was their prepaid offering. And suddenly a mobile phone went from being something that maybe stockbrokers and tradesmen had and salespeople out on the road, to something that anybody gave. You give someone as a present. There was lots of Christmas trees in 1998 that had cheap mobile phones underneath them, and with £20 in credit, and you could give them to their children. And that completely revolutionised. And if you look at the take-up or the adoption rate of penetration of mobile telephony, just around those 3 years, like around 97 to 2000, it just went mad. It went from being a minority to being almost 100% within a few years. So another important inflection point.
Very good, very good. And I suppose that pace of democratization is fascinating, especially for someone that's maybe younger in the telecom space. For me to have your insight and to look back on this is really interesting, because I think so much of my generation would never have seen an old landline or an old telegraph system or anything like that.
You wouldn't also remember the rows over the phone bill, because the phone for my generation, the phone was in the hall and it was shared with the family, and there were rows about the phone, and calls were relatively expensive. They were very much distance and time based, so calling even somewhere 50 kilometres away would be more expensive, and there were regular rows in every family when the phone bill would arrive. Who was using the phone?
Yeah.
Once the mobile phone, not only did it was yours, and it was your number, you made the calls, you were responsible. So parents and teenagers could just sort of say, take it out of your pocket money, buy your credit on that, and it solved a whole load of problems.
Exactly. We're very, very, very fortunate today that we don't have those qualms or those problems, though. Count our luck. One of the aspects of the book that I think is important to highlight and mention is in relation to the role of females and women in the history of telecoms in Ireland. I know myself, from working in the space in the last few years, there's been massive improvements and quite a lot of momentum in terms of ensuring that there is stronger female participation, not just at the bottom of the telecom sector, but also up at the C-suite level. And it is great to see that there's been improvements there in recent years. But Ireland was quite progressive from a telecoms perspective in this area as well, historically.
Yeah, going back to the telegraph companies, which kind of arrived in Ireland from about 1852, the dominant one in Ireland, so there were private companies that started it. And the dominant one in Ireland was called the Magnetic, and it was headquartered in the north of England, and a lot of the shareholders were and investors were cotton mill dealers, and that's what they were interested in. The telegraph was to send messages between the cotton mills and the textile mill suppliers and so on. And they had a lot of female employees, and they found them very useful and very reliable and whatever. So when the telegraph started, and initially there was lots of men involved, but that company thought that using female operators they tried it out and they found women were very good at it. So that then became kind of a standard in the industry, that the telegraph industry employed lots of women. And then in parallel, then when the telephone arrived, almost across the world the same thing happened. Exchanges, first exchanges opened around 1880 in many places, and Dublin was about a year later. The first operators were boys, literally boys, and they were found to be troublesome because in the case of the Dublin exchange, that the boy was sacked for playing marbles in the yard. And they went like the telegraph industry and started to employ women and found women much more reliable and much more polite, and so on. And the role of a telephone operator, in a completely manual switched network, there were lots of operators needed. And in a time where there really was very few other opportunities for female employment other than domestic service or something like that, this gave a whole lot of women independence. They had a job, in a reasonably good environment, and some of the working conditions were quite heavily supervised in a even more extreme way than perhaps modern call centres are. But still, it was reasonably good conditions and very reliable and often pensionable and so on. It gave a lot of women independence. But if you look, you mentioned there about modern life in C-suite. If you look at at org charts and look at the names of the managers and the technical staff and so on, no, it was still very male dominated. But you still can't have to give credit for the fact that there were a lot of women involved, and a lot of women got nice reliable jobs out of it.
Very good, very good. And one of the parts of the book I think I was fascinated most by, Deryck, was the level of detail and no doubt the painstaking research that you had to go through to collect all the information and to actually, I suppose, consolidate that in a way that is accessible and readable to many different readers. Curious, was there any surprising discoveries or revelations that showed up during your research process that surprised you and that had an impact on the development of the book itself?
The research involved a lot of archives, and I very much enjoyed that. I guess it's probably happens for most people looking at archives. 90% of the stuff is not relevant, but sometimes that in that 10% you find absolute gems. So I can remember one of the first days. It possibly strikes me the most because it was one of the first days that I was doing the research for it, and I was in the BT archives in London. And now this is before COVID, and it was the time I think that Theresa May had called a snap election, and it hadn't gone well for her, and she was now dependent on the support of the DUP. So the newspapers over there were talking about the DUP and Arlene Foster and all, and that was kind of news for them. And I walk into the BT archive in Holborn in London, and I'd ordered a whole lot of material in advance, and one of the first things I picked up off this trolley was a folded up map. And at the top it said map of the Free State Northern Ireland border, and it wasn't dated, but it seemed to be from the mid or late 20s, and what it showed was that the two authorities, the post offices north and south, seemed to have agreed to bend the border a little bit, so that some places in the north would be serviced, because that's where the kind of the trunk exchange, the lines were laid, that some places in the north would have been served by the south and vice versa. Okay. One of the places in the north that was been served by the south was Rosslea in County Fermanagh, which is where Arlene Foster was from, who was very much prominent in the news at the time. So I just thought this was funny, as a prominent unionist politician, that her ancestors' home was if they'd had a phone, was being serviced by P&T employees from the Free State for a period anyway. It was just an example. It was this kind of stuck together literally with sellotape map, and quite a large format one. I remember spreading it out over the table, and I mentioned to the staff there that maybe it needs conservation, because to my mind it was kind of important. It was anyway, it was obviously many important documents. It's just one example. There was plenty there, but it sort of showed that, at that time there was lots of talk about a hard war, or what the border would be, and it showed that 100 years before that, actually the border had been quite porous, and the two authorities had cooperated, and I suppose it comes down to the fact that technically a lot of engineers and technical staff just want to provide a service, and they'll kind of overcome some of the politics involved, and that's what they did on the ground. They somehow agreed it between themselves, and I presume it worked.
That's very interesting, very, very interesting story, and I suppose, as you said, it shows the fundamental interlink between infrastructure, politics, and I suppose the societal environment at the time. Very, very interesting. And I want to bring you now, you touched upon the point, and we've touched upon it already, that the book was published during the pandemic, in fact in the depth of the pandemic at the end of 2021. I'm interested in understanding how the pandemic changed your perspectives on the importance and relevance of telecoms, and indeed how maybe it brought more urgency to some of the I suppose detail that you outlined in your book in relation to the importance of telecoms infrastructure for society.
I noticed it had a very big impact on one important announcement. The National Broadband Programme had been announced, and the National Broadband Ireland appointed in a few months before the pandemic to some controversy. The amount of money involved, which is billions, was quite controversial. There was a lot of press controversy. Was this the right appointment? Was this the right thing to do? And as soon as the pandemic arrived, there was no more talk of that. I don't think there was any doubt that having fibre to every home is a good thing. I think that suddenly became very clear to everybody, and it completely changed the messaging around that. And what's happened since then, the rollout has been maybe a little bit slower than National Broadband the programme would have envisaged, but it seems to be catching up now. And what seems to be the case now is that we're mid-tier from a poor start. We're now kind of mid-tier in terms of OECD countries in fibre rollout, and we're well ahead of countries that traditionally we'd look up to, like the US or the UK or Germany. And I think a lot of that is simply down to government money through the National Broadband Programme, and as I said, the pandemic perhaps made that a lot easier.
Very good, very good. And I've no doubt myself that we are living through history at the moment in terms of observing MBI conduct its rollout. And I think it is another episode a significant episode in the history of telecoms in Ireland, that I suppose provision of multi-gigabit capable fibre to every premise in the country, and it's a really, really good example.
And it's sometimes hard when if you're witnessing history, it's hard to know you're witnessing it.
Yes.
But I think if you were to ask me this question, one of your first questions about inflection points, if you were to ask it again in a few years, we're probably living through an inflection point now. If you look at the rate of fibre rollout, it's quite aggressive, and I hear just anecdotal stories of people in all sorts of places in the country who are God, we've got fibre, we've much better broadband speeds than so and so, but so it really is happening.
Definitely, there's no doubt about that. And on that point, and I suppose building on that, how do you think Ireland's history from a telecoms perspective, and indeed the one that you've explored in the book, can serve as a model for other infrastructure developments into the future? So I'm thinking about our significant state commitment to investment in renewables, solar, wind, offshore energy, and other areas. Is there lessons?
There are, definitely. I think the primary one is really the role of government. It is actually critical in this, that they, for many decades, they neglected telecoms, and as a result, the network was very poor, and that in turn had exerted a toll in the economy. But by the 70s, there were documented cases of lack of foreign investment because of the fact the telecoms infrastructure was so poor. And ironically, the government had kind of a model for infrastructure investment in the form of the ESB, which is a semi-state. That overcame a lot of the problems that having a directly state-controlled organisation at P&T had. So the ESB was free. It largely set its own budgets, and it could borrow itself and so on. So that sort of government policy around ownership and investment and so on is vital, and it will be the same for other infrastructural rollouts as well.
Very good, very good. And I can tell just from sitting here, and I'm sure people watching this can tell as well, that you really do ooze passion and interest in terms of the book, I'm not surprised whatsoever that the detail is so intricate in the book based on your own interest in the space. And I wanted to kind of hone down on that and understand what was the most enjoyable aspect for you personally in terms of writing the book, researching, talking to people, collecting all the information.
So, possibly some of the most enjoyable parts were going to the archives and finding those little nuggets like the map that I spoke about, but also talking to people about getting individual stories about people who worked in the sector and getting their contributions. And I kind of tried to bring the book to life by putting in anecdotes to illustrate points and so on. I think one of my favourites was actually a friend, a former work colleague, who as a child grew up in, well, she still lives in Donegal, she grew up in Donegal, and as a child she remembers lifting the phone in Glenties taking a call from the operator of Glenties Manual Exchange. She was a young girl, her parents didn't answer the phone in time, and they came over to her and asked her, so who rang? Oh, somebody phoned and somebody's dead. And they were able to ring Nancy in the exchange and back and say, Nancy, Michelle took the call. Do you know by any chance who put that call through? And Nancy was able to tell them who had originated the call, and they were able to trace back who exactly had died.
Okay, wow, okay.
So it's little stories like that that I enjoyed hearing and enjoyed writing and including in the book, just to illustrate. For a younger audience that makes absolutely no sense. It's just a time gone past. But that happened 40 years ago.
Very good and very valuable for me to hear that as someone that, I suppose, as I said already, has grown up in a completely different era. And that brings me to a question about, is there any kind of aspects of telecoms, and indeed I suppose that the historical context in Ireland has actually remained constant over the last 170 years?
Yes, I think the constant improvement in bandwidth, I think, is the most constant theme throughout. That first telegraph cable, the first one laid between Howth, which failed very quickly. Yeah. There was just a single circuit of copper on it. The first one to be laid across the transatlantic just had a single, very thin strand of copper. There's the 180 word message that was sent, I think, from Queen Victoria to the President in the US at the time took several hours to transmit, essentially because of errors. And so now what we'd call error correction was simply somebody saying please repeat or whatever. And the bandwidth just constantly improved. They were able to, even fairly quickly, they were able to bring in techniques where they could transmit faster. They brought in duplex working fairly quickly, which is like form of multiplexing that we now deployed completely throughout telecoms. So even in the 19th century, they were able to increase bandwidth, and it's just constant improvement, and then into the modern age with data and so on. It's just a quest for more broadband, moving from a largely copper network to fibre.
Very good, and a common theme and a recurring theme, speaking to the constant nature that's evident throughout the book, is the rivalry between wireless and wired infrastructure. And indeed, coming back to the National Broadband Plan, I'm sure we're all very well aware that at the outset there was conflict between two camps, distinct camps that were in favour of having some wireless component, using technologies like fixed wireless access, satellite or whatever, maybe to connect the most difficult or costly premises, rather than what some at the time would have described as a Rolls-Royce full fibre solution to every household. I'm curious if you can speak to that conflict historically.
Yeah, I mean, the first wireless telegraph station was established in Connemara. That was really a response to what was perceived to be the rates charged by the fixed line, the submarine telegraph operators. And Marconi thought that they were charging quite a lot, and there was money to be made here by undercutting them. He could still make a profit by undercutting them. So there was that rivalry. And I think what's happened now is that we've settled into a kind of a niche where both the wireless and the wired both occupy the best spaces for them. So it's typically, we now use wireless just for the last few meters of access, whether it's within your own home to a Wi-Fi point or maybe to a few hundred meters if you're away from home and you're using data like 5G between that and the base station, and from then on it's largely probably over fibre. So I think people completely overestimate the amount of data that travels on satellite. Often media. reports of communications will be, they'll show satellite dishes.
Absolutely.
And yet they're not really used. The one in Ulster Down near Middleton in County Cork that was established by Telecom Ireland in the 80s, that actually didn't stay in revenue service for I think it was more like about 8 years. That's all it was used for. And it's now a research, and I think they're looking for crowdsourcing to refurbish it. So there's lower orbiting satellites are very useful now for certain things, but they still have a quite a niche role to play. So I think we sort of sorted out for the moment the wireless and wired one. There will be innovations in the future and might change that balance, but at the moment they're kind of complementary, I'd say, rather than rivals.
Absolutely, and it's something I could only agree with. And I know even within the wireless space, there's constant back and forth in industry between the relevance and applicability of cellular versus Wi-Fi. I think those kind of debates will continue, but I always would stress the point that there's never a one size fits all solution in telecoms, and different use cases require different things. And at the outset, you touched on the importance of security and telecoms and the role that the state has to play in that. And unfortunately, we live in times at the moment where politically there is increasing destabilizing events or prevalence of such events. I wonder if there are any lessons from the past experience in Ireland about how we should work moving forward in terms of telecom security, and making sure that we are prepared for different scenarios. I think only in the last few weeks there was a major global cyber outage, and that again underlined our vulnerability as a society today. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that in the context of what has happened in the book and in the past.
Yes, as I said at the start, it seems that in the 20s, at the foundation of the state, and the War of Independence and the Civil War and the damage that had been caused at that point, that it kind of left a feeling that Ireland wasn't a safe place, and there were very few cables laid after that. It wasn't until '88 that another transatlantic cable was landed in Ireland. I just worry that perhaps the same thing might happen, that if we're not perceived as a safe place, that infrastructure might bypass it. We're very well connected now. I think there's roughly around 20 cables connecting the island, but it could be that future investment might look at us if we're perceived as not being able to secure our infrastructure, that we might get bypassed again, and that would be a shame, because our economy now is those initial transatlantic cables were largely, Kerry was used just as a convenient point. They were largely taking messages from stockbrokers in London to New York and back again. Now there's data centres in Ireland and a big tech industry here that's intimately requires that connectivity. And if we were bypassing as investment, it probably means is that the cables then that bandwidth gets used up and it becomes more expensive. And then if you want to put some infrastructure in that needs bandwidth, well, then you might look elsewhere. So yeah, I think we just need to be careful that we don't repeat that lesson, that we're perceived as being a safe place for infrastructure investment.
Okay, that's a very salient point and a forward-looking one. And to conclude, I think probably one of the most moving images, there are many in the book, I think you paint is the contrast between the now and the past, and the now being scenes from streets like Grafton Street, as you mentioned in the book, and Patrick Street, whereby there are scores of people with their heads down in their phones, connecting to data centers across the world. And it was a very different scenario if you go back 170 years, where no one could have imagined this. If we're to look ahead maybe 10-15 years, how do you think things will change? I know it's a difficult question, but with your own insight into the past, I'm curious how you see things moving forward.
I guess the way we consume will depend on if somebody comes up with a new idea, a new way of us consuming content. At the moment it's very screen based, and people look at a screen, or they sometimes listen, but it's very much based on the idea that you have a device in your hand and you hold it. If through glasses or something changes, then maybe we all wander around with something on our heads. I don't know. I think it would be that. I think until somebody comes up with a new idea of how to get the content into our heads, that we will remain wedded to our screens. But if somebody comes up with that, then it literally Grafton Street could look very different.
Very good. And I think definitely your point kind of speaks to my own, I suppose, view that the question about the next category of devices, and I suppose the networks that will need, and it's actually very apt because we're here in Trinity at the moment, and the Connect Research Centre is very close by. I think the question is not if we will get those devices, very much when. And I think we're kind of between transition and evolutionary periods at the moment as operators invest and try desperately to monetize 5G, and as we look towards 6G, and I suppose maybe even new forms of deploying infrastructure in terms of open RAN, disaggregated networks, software defined networks. So it's a fascinating period ahead.
Yes, it will be.
It will be, and I just want to thank you very much for your time, Deryck. It's been really fascinating to chat to you, and definitely it's something that I will look back on in the future. I know down the line, hopefully, and I know for future generations, I hope that they will get an opportunity to read this book, and I do hope as well that when we start to look back in the next few years on things like the National Broadband Plan, as we mentioned, that they will be worthy of their own book as well in the future. And it is such a I think a national treasure to have these resources consolidated into a really engaging, accessible book. And I do recommend any of you, if you haven't already, to give the book a read, and you certainly won't be disappointed.
Right. Thank you very much, Luke.
Thanks, Deryck.